Then an unruly mob managed to overcome federal law enforcement and storm the Capitol on January 6th, 2021. Or were protesters lured and even coerced to enter the Capitol building on that day? Blaze News investigative journalist Steve Baker sat down with J. Michael Waller. He's a senior analyst for strategy for Center for Security Policy to examine the numerous security failures that were overlooked during that day. Without further ado, here's Steve's interview.
Mike, J. Michael Waller. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. You and I have come into acquaintance because of a particular incident that happened at the Capitol 4 years ago. And since then, I have had the great pleasure to get to know you better, not only on a personal level, but also as a result of this and some other of your work. Big Intel, it came out, was it early this year, 2024?
January.
Yeah, January. And then I had to apologize to you because you sent me an advance copy back late in 23 to do a review. And because of what was happening, not only at the Blaze and in my own personal life related to that incident 4 years ago, I wasn't able to get to that review till some months later. So I finally got to it. But thank you for being here with me today.
It's great to be with you here.
Yeah.
It's been 4 years, can you believe it?
I know it. It has been. And let's start there, because we'll go back and get some of your background for those who are unfamiliar with you. But I want to start with what happened at the genesis of our relationship. And it was not something that I had planned on, being in DC on January 6th and then of 2021, and then it becoming what it was. Of course, there's a lot of accusations that people make that I was somehow knowledgeable about what was going to take place. Even the FBI and the Department of Justice originally insinuated that about me. They told me that I went to DC on January 6, 2021 with the intent to profit from an illegal event. And they were going to charge me originally with a felony interstate racketeering. So the only way that could have been true is that I crossed state lines with the foreknowledge that criminal event was going to happen, and that I intended to profit from it by selling my videos to news organizations. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. I had no idea.
They were projecting.
Right. And so it happened. The day happened. I came home. I spent 5 days doing frame-by-frame analysis of my video. I started writing. And on January 13th, 1 week later, I published my first article on January 6th. And it was simply titled What I Saw at the Capitol on January 6th. And as soon as that goes out, I start getting messages from other people saying, you need to read this article. And it was by a guy named J. Michael Waller. So I did. And I think it was immediately thereafter we exchanged messages, and take it from there. I mean, what was happening on your side?
Oh, it was one of those days where well, first, I live on Capitol Hill, and I've been in DC for the better part of, since 1980, when I went to college as a freshman when Jimmy Carter was still president. So I'd been to tons of protests in DC, either as a participant or an observer. And this was the morning of January 6th. It was just another morning, and I didn't want to go to this protest. I didn't want to get up, and it was kind of depressing because I thought you've got this Obama, warmed over Obama crew coming in to take over under Biden. And it was just kind of like, well, no. And then we said, well, you know what? We need to have one last time to see real Americans getting together.
Right.
And let's just go out and be there. So we went out and we walked from Capitol Hill. Trump was still giving his speech at the White House. So we walked toward the White House. It's about 1.5 miles. And right up around 13th Street, 3 blocks before the White House, we're talking to the cops. We're talking to small groups of DC National Guard that were there. They were listening to the president's speech, and it was very relaxed. The security was very low. We went right past the Capitol Police headquarters, chatted with a Capitol Police guy who was just putting on his shin guards. He was relaxed. There was no sense of alert or alarm or anything. And then we saw the march going down Constitution Avenue toward the Capitol while the president was still speaking, and thought, well, let's just go along. So that's how it began.
Yeah. Now, so you actually went out, you were with your wife at the time?
Yeah.
So you went towards the Capitol, or past the Capitol even, and Trump was still on the stage.
Yeah.
See, I this is my failing memory. I thought I recalled that you didn't actually even leave the house until after the alarm bells went off and you were seeing riotous behavior on television.
No, we went to, so we have to walk through the Capitol grounds to go from where I live toward the White House. And no, it was relaxed. Nothing was happening.
Right.
The alert was low. And so, and I know the various states of alert, you can see them. And then when they have the K-9 units out there, they didn't even have K-9 units.
Right.
And so we didn't think anything was going to happen. So we walked up to the district building, which is the DC City Hall, where there was supposed to be an event there. Well, that event had gone and they'd moved over to the White House by then. And so we just then followed back. We didn't even go up to the White House because we've been there millions of times. Why go again? And we thought, let's just follow everybody back toward the Capitol.
And then when you got there, what happened?
Well, first it was just normal Americans. You can tell the tourists because they're all looking around at the historic buildings and them, always confusing the Capitol building with the White House or whatever. But it was nice people to the point where they were even picking up somebody else's candy wrapper on Constitution Avenue. And it was very nice, very cordial. Everybody's chatting with everybody. It was a slow pace, but we could see little squads of younger men going in groups of 3, groups of 5, running ahead of everybody with their faces covered. Now, this is all MAGA people. They weren't wearing masks, but these groups were. And so we thought, what are these guys up to? But still didn't pay it much thought. But we saw how the DC government made it hard for people in advance, because always when there are protests, they have porta potties, plenty of them, lining the streets. They didn't have them.
None.
In fact, they had to open up the Ronald Reagan building. The Trump administration did, just so people could use the bathroom. But you didn't have people, going in the bushes or making a mess or being in any way out of line. And then down by the Canadian Embassy, there was a group of porta potties as you got closer to the Capitol. But for hundreds of thousands of people, it wasn't enough. Yet people were still orderly and still polite, except for these squads. So it turns out we were about 3 blocks behind Ray Epps and his group. Never heard of the guy before, didn't know anything that was going on. So we were toward the beginning of the march, but we were not at the beginning of the march. We just happened to see them coming by, looking down the street. But going on the Capitol grounds, well, the hurricane fence is down. It was up just the other day. This is all open area. The bike rack barriers were stacked perpendicular to the entrance, as though in an orderly way, as if somebody had opened them. There were no Capitol Police to be seen anywhere, no K-9 units, no loudspeaker system, which they practice all the time because we can hear them from the House. So we thought, this is really weird. You've got a joint session, or both houses of Congress are in session, and you can tell because the flags are up over the House and the Senate chamber, and zero security.
Let's stop right there, and I want you to explain why your eye captured those things and recognized those things, as opposed to the average person who would not even think about looking for or seeing what you described as a squad of guys with masks, or the missing fences, or the lower security, especially on a joint session of Congress with the vice president in the building, et cetera, et cetera. Why do you see that kind of thing?
Well, first, it's my neighborhood.
Okay.
And you know what's going on in your neighborhood. and you know the beat cops in your neighborhood if you care to walk around.
Yeah.
I'd had on and off relations with the Capitol Police since 1983. So I knew them, I knew how they work. In fact, when I worked as a Senate staffer, and it was in a Senate annex for a while, which is now the Capitol Police headquarters. So these are my neighbors.
Okay.
In fact, the Capitol Police have jurisdiction over my house.
All right.
So you just notice these things, and when they do their regular drills for the loudspeaker system, you know they've got a built-in loudspeaker system because you can hear it from the house.
Right.
And but you pay respect to the security protocols too, so you don't go, when they've got the hurricane fence up, you know that something is going to go on. You don't interrupt it, you just happen to know.
Yeah.
But also, I'd been involved in protests for a long time with Young Americans for Freedom and college Republicans, going all the way back to Reagan's first election. And so you know what to do and what not to do, and you know how the protest security works. And then I've been to a lot of left-wing protests too, as a provocateur of sorts.
Talk about that.
Well, it started in the 80s when the Washington Post was covering all these nuclear freeze protests, unilateral nuclear disarmament protests. And these were organized by the Communist Party, but the Post would never report that. So we would go march, and our hair was sort of down to here, and we would get dressed up grungy, and we'd have hammer and sickle flags walking among the communists just to show these were real Marxist-Leninists who were running these protests.
So you were running actual false flag operations?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. As a kid, we didn't know what we were doing. Nobody put us up to those.
Is this the only country you've done that in?
No, and that's how. I didn't want you to ask me that.
Well, I mean, if we're gonna talk about this book, you're gonna have to give away some of your. You gave away a lot of your secrets here in Big Intel.
A few. Well, there was an event in the Soviets spent a lot on active measures.
Yeah.
These were covert political campaigns to undermine us, to undermine our military allies, to undermine NATO. And so when I was a college kid in the early 80s, that was the peak of their active measures time. And they had an international organization called the World Peace Council. And so we went to a World Peace Council event that they had in Denmark. It was the biggest event they'd had outside the USSR in years. And young people didn't want to join these things anymore to speak of. It was mostly, Vietnam era, Vietniks and old red diaper type people. But so they were eager for younger people to join. So we set up a Marxist front group, pretending to be a Marxist front group, and they were happy to have us go. So we went there, but we went for the purpose of disrupting it. And it was amazing what you can do for very little. So we were there, tightly controlled, Soviet-controlled thing, but to make it look like it was very broad and very ideologically diverse. And we noticed that the Greens Party, the left-wing environmentalists and so forth of Europe, were being frozen out. They were on the planning committee, but when the conference, the whole big event, jamboree began, they were not allowed to actually run it. It was all Soviet security running the whole thing.
So we're doing this in kind of hopscotch order here than what I would normally do. Normally I would have you go through your bio first of all, but let's do a quick lightning round on your bio, how you got into that, because you've been working within and part of the IC, intelligence community and such for a long time. You basically started there, right?
Well, it actually started on my own in high school. I got involved in the anti-nuclear environmental movement. They were building a nuclear plant in my home state in New Hampshire. And I didn't like the idea that there was going to be a 6-foot pipe pumping water from the reactor cooling systems into the ocean where I'd go fishing with my dad and my grandpa. That's how I got involved as a real environmentalist.
Yeah.
So, but then they were choosing high school kids from different high schools, like who's got leadership potential or who's really into this. And so I was invited to get further involved, and they had these professionals come in from California to screen people. And I was one of those who was picked, and they put me in what I later learned was a struggle session to tear myself down, to tear myself apart. And they said, why do you want to be involved in our movement? And I said, well, because I care about the environment. And their attitude was like, you stupid kid. This is all about overthrowing American capitalism. I didn't sign up for this, but I kind of went along to see what was happening. And then
Right.
I realized, I'm going to fight these people for the rest of my life. So that's how it started.
Okay.
On my own. So in college then, in going to George Washington University, which has a downtown campus right next to the White House, fall of 1980, Reagan's elected president.
Right.
So I cast my first vote for Reagan, absentee, but showing voter ID and telling the town clerk that I was going to be away for a legitimate reason.
Right.
It was an exciting time to be there, and I was an intern in the U.S. Senate, and it was just a really great time. But there were all kinds of anti-Reagan protests, and I thought, well, people have to go in and expose these guys. I know what to look for now as a kid. And then I met with other journalists and conservative people and other former leftists who came out to expose this. And I was, when David Horowitz and Peter Collier first came out, and those guys, they were a big influence.
Yeah.
And they said, well, let's expose this stuff, not just by writing about it, but going in and dressing up like them and carrying that Soviet banner and exposing it for what it is. So that's how it started. And then through that, I got involved with the White House on being a student journalist going to Central America with the Nicaraguan Contras to overthrow the Sandinista government. And as a part of that, that was my entry into working for CIA Director Bill Casey.
Okay, so we'll get back to that, but you, by doing these things, let's go back to January 6th. We're jumping back again. So you recognized on January 6th activities that you had been involved in 40 years before that.
Yeah.
Specifically, I mean, because when your article came out, I think it was the same day as mine. Either it was the 12th or the 13th.
Yeah.
Mine was on the 13th. And so our readerships were cross-pollinating the two of us and telling us about each, because we basically saw the same thing. Now, I didn't see it through the same lens of experience that you had. It took me going back, as I said, and just really drilling down on my own videos for 5 days, around the clock, frame by frame by frame analysis, and then going, what is that? Yeah. Who is that? What is he doing? And part of my own personal story related to that first week following January 6th is I actually went and hid out and socked myself away at a Special Forces retired guy's house so I could get my work done. Because when the dragnet was thrown by the FBI, that was literally the next day. They started making the arrest on the 7th. And of course, then it starts hitting the news. So I don't know. I'm like, what is going to happen to me? I have no idea. So I just knew that I needed to get my story out. And then I would go home and take, whatever they wanted to do to me at that point. And so I poured through the video, wrote the story, rather lengthy, 9,500 word screed. And then when I got it out, I went home. And, but it was, as I said, during that time, I'm allowing a Special Forces guy to look over my shoulder, and he's seeing what I'm seeing on the screen, and he's tapping on my screen going, okay, this is his job, this is her job, this is what he does. And what are you talking about? He goes, well, that's what we do overseas in color revolution operations.
Yeah. I saw something similar on the outside of the Capitol, and it was, they had people in color-coded, with color-coded tape.
Yeah.
And they wore them either on the back of their shoulders or on the back of their hat. And so, I saw this there, and I didn't write about it at the time, but I noticed it, and then in looking through my own videos afterward, could see it very clearly. But we could see it at the time, like, who are these orange tagged guys? Who are the blue tagged people? What are they doing? And this was part of the story, because what the media was reporting was this was a spontaneous insurrection incited by President Trump during his speech. But what I saw was a pre-organized operation that had been planned well in advance. that was regimented with discipline and different units with different purposes. So this was nothing spontaneous. It had nothing to do with the president's speech. Somebody planned it well in advance and had everyone playing their role. For example, when with those different squads of people who simply didn't fit in with the crowd, they were going ahead at a fast pace, they were somewhat rude or at least careless, they were bumping into people as they were going ahead, and it was nothing like the character of the crowd itself. That was one group. But then you had these guys who were a bit older than I am, maybe Vietnam War vet type guys who with the demeanor of a good, sergeant, who were standing on short stone posts in the walkway going up from the Peace Memorial up that pathway where where Ray Epps went up.
Right.
And they were standing one on either side and telling people, do not retreat. Well, what is this retreat stuff? What is anybody telling the crowd what to do? These aren't police officers. They're not crowd control. They were there for a purpose, to keep packing more and more and more and more people in, because you had the crowds coming by the tens of thousands down Pennsylvania and Constitution Avenues, converging on the Peace Memorial site up this fairly narrow, maybe 30, 40 foot wide walkway with these low stone walls on either side. So there's very little room for maneuver with all of these people to push them up by the inaugural platform,
Right.
and to prevent them from leaving the area.
You and I had dinner last night, and we agreed that we would not discuss any of this in advance.
Yeah.
We wanted it to be fresh, and I did too. And based on that conversation we had, I actually deleted my notes and my questions that I had. I thought this is the way we need to do this. And now that it's shaping up the way it is, I'm kind of liking this thing of bouncing back between January 6th and your life and your career. So how did you go from being in Central America as a journalist to holding an M4 rifle in the jungle?
It was actually, they didn't have M4s then.
Well, yeah, no, right,
but it was right. It was
Was it M16?
well, it was AK-47s or M16s, or they had some FNFALs from the Venezuelan army.
Right.
And anyway, so it started out as it was a student journalism project. I was very interested in journalism, and there weren't many opportunities in journalism for conservatives back then. And I was working at the College Republican National Committee to promote President Reagan's, rollback Soviet communism program. And then I was with Young Americans for Freedom at the national level. So I was at the heads of these two national organizations that President Reagan loved. They were his favorite youth groups. And so as part of this, I got to be with the White House Office of Public Liaison, which was working with the coalitions to support President Reagan. So I had White House access then, but I was just still in college.
Yeah.
So it was remarkable. So I had a chance to go to Afghanistan. And now this is when, with Ahmad Shah Massoud's people in the Northern Alliance fighting the Soviet occupying forces.
I was going to say, this was while the Soviets were still there after invading in '79, right?
Right.
Okay.
So one of the journalists came to George Washington University to speak to our YAF chapter. And so I said, I'd love to go. How do I do it? And he says, well, come on. And so I'll arrange it for you. So I was going to do that. And I told Faith Whittlesey, she was Reagan's ambassador to Switzerland, but she came back to run a public affairs operation at the White House. And she said, no, don't go with Soldier Fortune. Don't do that. You speak Spanish anyway. Go to Central America. I said, okay, how do I do that? So she arranged for me to meet Constantine Menges, who was handling Reagan's Western Hemisphere affairs at the National Security Council. But Constantine was also a CIA man. He was a national intelligence officer for the Western Hemisphere, and he was CIA Director Bill Casey's man in the White House handling Central America. Casey was one of Reagan's closest friends and had been Reagan's campaign manager. And in his earlier life during World War II, he was in the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA, running operations behind Nazi lines to prepare the way for Eisenhower's forces to come from D-Day, Normandy, and march to Paris. So he had a really unconventional way of doing things, and the way Wild Bill Donovan had set things up at the OSS is you hire a lot of amateurs who don't know what they're doing because they don't know how they're not allowed to think.
Okay.
So you get those kinds of innovators, and that's how I got involved with that, and to go down to Central America as my own person, as a student journalist, but collecting intelligence for Casey, so that because the CIA was sort of unable to find certain things that were obvious, so I was just down there collecting what I thought was obvious.
One of the most singularly fascinating parts about the book is your historical perspective or recounting of how the OSS and FBI, paralleled one another, and then the differences between the two, between Wild Bill Donovan over on the OSS, which became CIA side, and then of course Hoover on the FBI side, and then how those characters clashed in terms of operation and ideology.
Yeah.
Give me just give us a real quick background on that, because that's I think that's a very important thing that literally every American should know at least a little bit about this, because we can't understand the threat of our own intelligence community if we don't understand where they came from. And that's what you really excel at in this book.
Yeah. And also the importance of the U.S. intelligence community if we don't know where it came from. If you think of the FBI, its predecessor was founded in 1908, not just to fight interstate crime, but there was so much anarchist and left-wing terrorism sweeping the country in that period. You had political assassinations, you had bombings, dozens of bombings. You had attempts to murder the Attorney General. You had bombs going off in downtown Washington, D.C., including one that shook the home of a young Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, long before he was president. So the FBI was in its earliest stages, was fighting this kind of left-wing bombing, mostly from immigrants who had come here for the specific purpose of causing trouble. So during World War I, there was a young attorney at the Justice Department who did his wartime duty fighting the inner cells within our country, and his name was John Edgar Hoover. Hoover had, his first job was to hunt down subversives. And one of his earliest actions was to round up foreign-born radical socialists, communists, and anarchists, put them on a ship and send them back to Russia. And he was
Mass deportation?
mass deportation of targeted communists and anarchists and socialists.
Wow.
Sent
the
them
people
back.
we should be deporting.
Exactly the
Right.
people we should be deporting. And he was only in his 20s when he did this. And he requisitioned a retired U.S. Navy ship from World War I. This was just just a few years later. And he brought a congressional delegation to go up and to watch this deportation. So then you had more waves of terrorism. So then he wrote up lists of places, radicals to be raided, and worked with the local law enforcement across the country to do this. But of course, you just had, basic telephone and mostly telegraph services there, and it was a good try, but it didn't get a lot of the bad people that needed to be gotten, and it got some innocent people. But what he was doing was fighting communist, Marxist, anarchist subversion, the same stuff we have today,
Right.
but before it could infiltrate our system,
Right.
to get them out of the country.
Yeah.
Imagine had he succeeded at that.
If he had.
Imagine if he had, 100 years later, well, how much better would our country be if he had rounded them all up and deported them 100 years ago?
What stopped him?
Public outcry, lack of resources, lack of laws. Didn't have laws for a lot of these things.
But isn't it the right, it's First Amendment protected activity to have those viewpoints and those radical ideas, even if those radical ideas lead to ultimately the overthrow of the Constitution?
No.
It's not.
No, when you come here to this country, you take an oath that you will uphold the Constitution. You take an oath that you're not part of some order that's going to overthrow our Constitution. So they lied when they came here. They lied when they took their oath to either get a visa to come here or to become citizens of the United States. So send them back.
And so those 40 million people that have crossed our southern border in the last 20 years haven't taken any oath, right?
No, no oath at all. So we have no contractual relationship with them. Get them out.
Now you're contrarian to a lot of modern historians and particular media punditry as it relates to J. Edgar Hoover. You're a fan.
Yeah. I didn't start out as I respected him for what he built. I thought he stayed way too long. And anyone who's going to imagine being director for 48 years.
Right.
First, it's way too long. But even if you're director for 4 years, you're going to make mistakes. But look at what he did right. What did he do? As director, he was not only enforcing the few laws that there were to enforce, he was not only cracking down on interstate crime and organized crime, he was warning our country about where we were headed based on what he saw. He said, you have communists coming into this country, they're infiltrating our media, they're infiltrating our universities, they're infiltrating our public schools, they're infiltrating our seminaries, they're infiltrating entertainment and government. We have to be vigilant against this. He was calling for this since the 1920s.
Is the allegations of his cross-dressing or closet homosexuality a lie?
I think if they were true, he'd be the poster boy of the FBI today. They'd have him in rainbow colors.
That's a great answer. What's the difference in the formation of OSS and what eventually became CIA? Because what caught me by surprise, and I was not familiar with, and what I learned from your book, Big Intel, is how much talent was deliberately recruited from actual Marxists and Soviets, because we didn't have the talent. So we didn't have the history of the, MI5, MI6. We didn't have the long multi-generational centuries of intelligence that the Brits had. And we're starting afresh and anew, and we have nothing. But the real talent was over in Europe, and unfortunately we were borrowing talent from the wrong team, right?
Oh, yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
Well, imagine we had no intelligence service as World War I was breaking out. World War II was breaking out. Yeah, to say nothing of earlier. We had zero. We had naval intelligence, we had a little bit of army intelligence, but that was purely military. But we didn't have any agency to collect information to inform the president on what's happening around the world. And we really had very little counterintelligence, which was to fight foreign spies that were here. That was the FBI's job, but it was only a small job of what the FBI was doing. So as we have Imperial Japan, Fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, building up and already beginning their war, and here we have nothing. We needed something. So President Roosevelt decided, yeah, we need to have an intelligence service. The British, who needed our help, said, we will help you build it. So we were benefiting from Britain's long experience on it. But the British action officer at their embassy in Washington, his name was Dickie Ellis, who helped set up the Office of Strategic Services. He's a British intelligence officer. He was also a double agent for Stalin. So our OSS was set up with the instrumental assistance of a double agent for Stalin. Now that was a British officer.
Right.
Then you had President Roosevelt pick William Donovan, who was a great pick to head the Office of Strategic Services and what became that OSS. He was a lawyer. He was a really cool character. He was a very successful attorney, but he set up the New York National Guard cavalry unit to hunt down Pancho Villa. I mean, he had a magnificent experience. Roosevelt called him in to set up the OSS. He relied on Dickie Ellis at the British Embassy, not knowing he was a Soviet spy.
Right.
But he needed all this subject matter expertise. He needed people who knew everything about Europe, who was who, what was what, where are the important German war facilities, the factories and so forth. What are the different rail routes? Who are the different people involved? Who can we get in there to run guerrilla operations in Italy or in Greece or someplace else that who do we have? Well, we had immigrants. We had lots of people who had firsthand knowledge, native fluency in the language, family networks throughout the countryside and so forth, really valuable contacts. But a lot of these people had fled because they were communists, and they came here. And instead of pledging allegiance to the United States in a serious way, they came here with the agenda to ultimately overthrow the United States, starting by ending World War II on Stalin's terms, not on our terms.
Right.
And Donovan was bringing them into the OSS. And instead of saying, well, you know what, this guy's a bad actor, but we need his expertise, let's use him and compartment him. No, he didn't do it. He even lied to Congress about what he was doing.
So Donovan was doing this with foreknowledge. He was actively engaged in subversion himself.
Yeah, and his thought was, I don't care, we need to fight the Nazis, we need to get whatever resources we can. You know, I kind of understand that mentality, but it's not like he wasn't warned. And Hoover's saying, wait a minute, you're bringing foreign communists in to run your analytical services to inform the president about how he should do his war planning. You're putting Stalin's people in charge of advising FDR.
Right.
And FDR already had enough of those people around him anyway. So Donovan wouldn't listen to any of that.
And then OSS became CIA.
It was, Truman abolished it right at the end of the war. He didn't even tell Donovan, he simply abolished it. And then we had a couple of years with no intelligence service at all, and then CIA was created out of that. They were careful to weed out a lot of the Soviet agents and communists, but a lot of them went into the State Department. But they took some of them, like Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse was a German communist who was part of a Stalin-era active measures operation to conduct revolution through attacking culture. He was one of the pioneers of what we now call cultural Marxism.
Right.
Marcuse came to the United States as one of these German refugees, went into the OSS, went in to advise the CIA and early U.S. intelligence, and he imported the Frankfurt School from Frankfurt, Germany to Columbia University, which brought us critical theory, critical law theory, critical race theory,
Right.
DEI. It's him. He was a U.S. intelligence man. In fact, the CIA website claims Marcuse as one of its own people.
Well, that's one of the most important threads that you have that runs throughout the entire book is the cultural Marxism as it turns into DEI, as it turns into critical theory. And I think if I remember my own review correctly, is that was what I think is the most essential and necessary understanding of your book is how that thread works all the way through our system until we get to where we are today.
I do remember some technicians who had developed what they called a psychotronic device that when you aimed it at people, you could create different moods with them. You could get them to be nervous. You could get them to act irrationally, or in ways that were fairly predictable, and even to get them to lose their minds. They were going to use it for crowd control or for influencing foreign leaders if you could aim it at them. I didn't know much about it at the time, and I didn't follow up on it, but I remember the first time I ever heard that term, it was psychotronic. I think it was radio waves, and then psychotropic, which was drugs. And it was people from the KGB who had brought this up at an event we had, and I said, well, you know, can we see this stuff? And they said, yeah, but then we never followed up. We were just too busy doing other stuff.
Well, there was, a recent congressional hearing. It was back in May of this year, and because we're nearing the end of 24 right now, so I don't know whether this interview will air before the end of the year or the first part of 25. But in May of 24, to be specific, on the directed energy weapons technologies that have been alleged to be a part of what people are calling the Havana syndrome. And there were three witnesses. One was an Army specialist in that field. Another was he's a journalist and a IC guy, dual career kind of guy from Germany. And then the third witness is a very high-powered DC attorney representing clients who have mostly from the State Department, as well as CIA and others who have been injured allegedly by these directed energy weapons. And during this congressional testimony, over and over and over and over again, the three witnesses refused to answer certain questions. It was actually very bipartisan. It was not contentious. Both Democrats and Republicans were trying to get to understand what these weapons were, and on numerous occasions, the witnesses were saying, respectfully, sir, ma'am, I can't answer that question unless we're in a SCIF, secure meeting, indicating that there's much more capabilities and technologies than even what the Soviets had. The way that I understand it is once we started buying some of this technology in '91, we put it on steroids at that point. Our laboratories are better, science is better, our capabilities are better. And then I've come into contact with individuals who have assisted in the development on the engineering side, both for operationally, but specifically for operationally in the field. In that congressional testimony, they indicated that in '91, the Soviets had what they referred to as a backpack-sized directed energy weapon that could be used to facilitate exactly what you were talking about. Agitation, could make somebody go insane. I had a 3-star general tell me through a cutout that, and this is an exact quote, he said, "Yes, we can stop your heart, we can make you shit your pants." And then he finished that quote by saying, "But I wouldn't need that on January 6th. He said, "All I would need is 4 or 5 of my best men to make January 6th happen." It's a 3-star general, SOCOM. What's your response to that as you look back 4 years at January 6th?
Well, anything's possible. If you look at, that was a coordinated action. We still don't know who coordinated it.
Right.
There's been no FBI most wanted notice for the actual leaders who planned that violence. There's no wanted notice. No one's ever been charged or convicted or anything. So
well, there were those that were accused. I was there sitting in the courtroom when the federal prosecutor pointed at the Oath Keepers and said they were the tip of the spear. They were the leaders of the insurrection. They weren't even on the campus when the violence broke out.
Yeah.
It was a lie.
So that's a big black hole.
Yeah.
There is no tip of the spear. Why? Why hasn't that been the number one priority?
To find out who did
the central planning of that. Somebody did. It was very careful planning with military special ops precision.
Military special ops precision. Care to speculate?
It could be anything from if it was a privately funded group, they would have been busted by now. Why is it that Senator Ted Cruz had to demand repeatedly, were there any FBI agents or assets involved in the planning or execution of criminal acts of violence at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th? And the FBI kept saying over and over, can't comment, can't comment, can't comment. It's a yes or no question.
Yeah.
Senator Ron Johnson's been there. A lot of people on the House have been there. No answer. So why is the FBI stonewalling on the biggest question of our time?
I have a member of the Special Forces unit that's largely unknown to the American people. It's very small. There's only 102 members of this particular unit. And one of these retired members happens to be an expert on whatever came of that Soviet backpack weapon in the development and the use, deployment of this technology, both overseas and domestically. he sat down with me one night in a black bag. Our phones were in Faraday cages meeting, and he said, he asked me not to reveal the current capabilities of that weapon for national security reasons. He told me that there were legitimate concerns and why we shouldn't do it. And in that meeting, I challenged him on some ideas about how and maybe why it could have been either members of his unit could have been operational on January 6th. I have no evidence whatsoever that this type of weapon was used, what they refer to as an agitation weapon. I have no intelligence, I have no proof that it was used whatsoever. I'll be very clear about that. But I was able to challenge him enough to the point where he agreed that there are elements within that community, because of their politics and because Trump had been presented as Hitler reincarnated, that even some members of that unit could be convinced to operate against him. Is that viable?
Well, think of it. Think if you were to go back to the OSS times. Let's say we had something before the OSS, and we had the power of looking into the future somehow. And you're a young American special ops guy, and you have a chance. Here's this Russian agent who's going to commit mass murder and start a world war. You can stop him, and you can change history. So imagine you've got this drumbeat. Trump is Hitler, Trump is Hitler, Trump is Hitler, Trump is a Russian agent, Trump is a Russian agent, he's a traitor to the country. It wouldn't take much for a patriotic American who really believes he's doing the right thing and who has the right training to think, I can be the man to stop a Hitler from taking over our country.
Or someone that could groom young, disaffected men to take a shot at a presidential candidate?
Sure. You're larger than life now. You have meaning to your life. You've prevented Hitler from taking over your country as a Putin tool. And let's remember, these people rightly complaining about Putin, although they were before Putin, before they were against him. Mm-hmm. They literally welcomed him taking power. Right. He had 2 members of my editorial board murdered, and 9 other people I know were pushed out of windows or shot or poisoned. So but to see these other people, the Mike McFalls of the world and the others, being so staunchly anti-Putin, I remember when they were pro-Putin.
Right.
And all of a sudden, so why this big reversal, and why this allegation that Trump is a foreign enemy? He's not just a bad person who we don't like. He's a foreign enemy, and he's Hitler. Well, of course that's going to rile people up, especially disaffected or alienated young guys who are not in the military, but they're LARPing their way through video games through life or something. This gives them meaning and purpose.
Right.